Julia Roberts stands as a towering force in Hollywood history, a living imprint burned into generations, the incandescent smile of Pretty Woman, the unflinching ferocity of Erin Brockovich, the woman who proved that grace can strike with the same force as power. She rose from uncertainty into legend through sheer will, carving her place inch by inch in an industry that grants nothing, forgives nothing, spares no one. Her presence rewrote romance, reshaped female stardom, and carried the emotional gravity of an entire era. Yet applause has always told only half the truth. Beneath the brilliance lies a chapter sharpened by pain that refuses to loosen its hold. Now, at 58, she stands where triumph offers no armor against what continues to press from the shadows. If Julia Roberts has ever shaken something inside you, you'll honor her journey with a like, and subscribe to the channel for the stories that begin when the applause truly falls silent. Long before Julia Roberts' smile became a symbol the world could recognize in a single heartbeat, it belonged to a child learning how quickly a home can turn quiet in the wrong way. Julia Fiona Roberts was born on October 28, 1967, in Smyrna, Georgia, into a household that looked brave from the outside and trembled from within. Her parents, Walter Grady Roberts and Betty Lou Bredemus, were actors who dared to open one of the first acting schools in their region that welcomed both black and white children, an act of quiet defiance in a divided South that drew the respect of Martin Luther King Jr. And Coretta Scott King, who later, in gratitude, discreetly covered the hospital bill when Julia entered the world. Yet courage in daylight did not prevent nightfall at home. Money was scarce, the walls were thin, and the pressure accumulated until the marriage collapsed in 1971, when Julia was 4. What vanished was not only a household, but a child's certainty that safety is permanent. Her father remained loving, but his absence hollowed the rooms. Years later, she would say the pain was not a moment you can point to, but a change in the air, a memory of how footsteps sounded farther away, how evenings felt longer, how longing can exist even when nothing dramatic happens at all. When Betty Lou remarried Michael Motes, fragility tipped into unpredictability. Raised voices replaced reassurance. Warmth arrived briefly and left without warning. Neighbors would later recall police being called to the home more than once. And Julia, alongside her brother Eric and sister Lisa, learned the choreography of caution, made the careful breathing of children who sense danger before it speaks. Stability never settled. Moves followed hardship, leaving her without a place that stayed. Even her voice carried the strain. A stutter caught her words mid-flight, as if fear held them back, and teachers noticed the girl who chose silence because silence did not betray her. Speech therapy helped, but it was acting, first imagined, then practiced, that gave her language again, a way to say what could not be said outright. In 1976, a half-sister, Nancy, was born into the same stretched household, sharpening the sense that love was real but fragile, and that promises could bend until they broke. These were not Hollywood beginnings. They were years tuned to the low hum of financial worry, shifting ground, and hope held together by habit. At 10, the weight had already made her smaller. Then the wound arrived that reshaped everything. In 1977, her father, her gentle anchor, died of throat cancer, an illness he kept hidden to protect her until protection was no longer possible. His passing felt like the last shelter lifting away. The house grew colder. Absence learned to echo. And yet, in his final devotion, he left a voice behind. Cassette tapes of bedtime stories recorded so his daughter would never be alone at night. Julia pressed play in the dark, curled into herself, and held the recorder as if it were his hand, returning to those stories until the tape thinned and the sound wore soft. She later described it as comfort and ache in the same breath, the relief of hearing him and the truth that the voice was all that remained. School offered no refuge. So the wide smile that would one day disarm the world was mocked as toothy, turning a future signature into a private bruise. Still, something refused to dim. Acting became a place where pain could be shaped without being announced, where a trembling voice could grow steady. Loss taught her how to listen. Ridicule taught her how to endure. Those early fractures did not disappear, they deepened her. And when the lights eventually rose, what audiences felt was not polish alone, but a human truth earned early. A child who learned to carry sorrow quietly and to transform it, without spectacle, into meaning that lasts. From a childhood broken into quiet pieces, a faint light learned how to stay lit. In 1985, only 17, Julia Roberts stepped into New York City with almost nothing, one small bag, a few $100s, and a resolve sharpened by instability she had already survived. The city did not welcome her, it tested her. Winter cut through thin coats, apartments shivered with cold, and nights lengthened as she learned to ration hunger the way others rationed hope. When subway money disappeared, she walked mile after mile through snow, shoes thinning, breath blooming white in the dark, each step an argument for staying. Doors closed without apology, casting agents glanced and dismissed, modeling calls dissolved into silence. Opportunity slipped away again and again. Well over 200 times the answer was no. And still, in those frozen rooms, the stomach hollow and spirit worn thin, she returned to a promise she reshaped every night to survive it. One more step, she told herself, never loud, never heroic, just enough to keep moving when no one was watching. Slowly, almost invisibly, the ground shifted beneath her feet. The first footholds were modest. A Clearasil commercial, a brief smile that earned a union card, proof she existed at the edge of the world she wanted. In 1987, a single episode on Crime Story followed. She arrived feverish, skin burning, unwilling to step aside. Special effects left burns, small marks that echoed injuries carried much deeper, yet she stayed. Discipline hardened into habit. Endurance became instinct. Those early jobs didn't rescue her from struggle. They trained her to stand inside it, to finish the day when her body protested, but to treat perseverance not as a virtue to display, but as a routine to keep. Looking back, she would frame that season as learning to show up even when everything hurts, a truth absorbed quietly, without ceremony, that would later surface on screen without being announced. Then came the choice that carved deepest. With cupboards bare and cold pressing in like a second skin, Julia held the last object that still felt like safety. Her father's antique watch, its metal worn smooth by the hand she once trusted most. Letting it go felt impossible. Still, necessity narrowed the world to a pawn shop counter and a pair of trembling hands. She slid the watch across. Tears softened its face until time itself seemed to blur. She would later remember the moment not as drama, but as rupture. Losing him again, quietly. A private severing done for rent. Yet the money kept her alive. The hollow it opened did not close. Years later, when recognition finally arrived, she searched until she found that watch and bought it back. She never wore it. It was not an ornament. It was evidence of hunger endured, of memory guarded, of a promise kept without applause. Momentum followed slowly. Mystic Pizza in 1988 revealed an intensity beneath her ease, Roger Ebert noting a major beauty with fierce energy. Pressure arrived immediately after. On Steel Magnolias in 1989, she was not the first choice. Scrutiny was relentless. Some days ended in tears as doubt pressed hard enough to crack resolve. She stayed. She poured old losses and fresh refusals into Shelby, letting lived pain do the work words could not. The result, cut deep, unguarded, is true. And at 22, she earned a Golden Globe and her first Academy Award nomination. Long before the world learned her name, Julia Roberts had learned how to carry what she loved through cold, hunger, and silence, and to turn survival itself into a craft that would not let go. From years spent being tested by doubt, rejection, and quiet endurance, the role that would bend Hollywood's spine finally arrived. In 1990, Julia Roberts stepped into Pretty Woman, and the industry shifted beneath her feet. But the glow was born in shadow. The script had once been cold and unforgiving, stripped of fantasy, and even after it was reshaped into modern myth, her place inside it remained precarious. The production company collapsed midstream, forcing her to audition again, as if everything she had survived could be erased in a single room. Even Richard Gere hesitated. And in that suspended moment, Julia reached for the only thing she had always relied on: vulnerability sharpened by will. She slid him a small note that read, "Please say yes." Years later, she would remember not the relief of being chosen, but the ache in her chest as she waited. The feeling of standing at a door you've knocked on your whole life, unsure if it will finally open. When he agreed, history took root, though what she felt first was not triumph, but a quiet, bone-deep release. She walked onto set without ceremony, her paycheck far smaller than her co-stars, carrying no illusion of royalty, only belief forged in hardship. Then the cameras rolled. The smile once mocked in childhood hallways disarmed the world. In the crimson gown, in the elevator, in that unguarded laugh, she crossed an invisible line. No longer just an actress, but a presence no one could look away from. Pretty Woman exploded past $460 million worldwide, but its deeper impact was cultural. Fashion shifted. Romance was rewritten. Beverly Hills became a pilgrimage site for dreamers. Then the world crowned a new America's sweetheart, never seeing the quiet strain beneath the crown. Off-screen, the light burned harsher. Her engagement to Dylan McDermott collapsed under flashes and headlines, intimacy dissolving under attention. She would later describe the sensation as belonging everywhere and nowhere at once. A loneliness that followed her home to empty rooms, makeup still on her face, staring into a mirror that no longer felt private, wondering where the girl inside it had gone. Rather than be preserved as a fairy tale, Julia chose risk. Sleeping with the Enemy, 1991, demanded terror that lingered long after the cameras stopped. Dying Young asked her to hold love and loss in the same breath. Even on the dazzling set of Hook, expectation pressed down, a reminder that fantasy offers no shelter from scrutiny. And these were not smooth ascents, but crucibles. She wept between takes, doubted herself, then returned to set anyway. Each role left a mark, each project another proof that resilience is built, not granted. By the late 1990s, a second coronation arrived. My Best Friend's Wedding gave audiences a flawed, aching woman they recognized. Notting Hill blurred the line between art and life, echoing her own longing for simplicity. Runaway Bride reignited familiar chemistry. Then, in 2000, she shattered a ceiling no woman had broken before. As Erin Brockovich, raw, defiant, unvarnished, Julia Roberts became the first woman in Hollywood to command $20 million for a single role. The film earned over $250 million worldwide. Critics hailed her ferocity. The Academy placed its golden statue in her hands. Laughing through tears, she said, "I'm just a girl from Smyrna, Georgia, and here I am." It wasn't a boast. It was survival speaking back to every doubt that had ever chased her. By 2001, her films had generated billions at the global box office, making her one of the most bankable stars in history. But numbers were never the measure. What endured was something quieter and harder to earn. That a girl who once walked through snow with worn shoes, who once let go of her father's watch to stay alive, carried every wound forward and transformed endurance into art. Not merely a sweetheart, Julia Roberts became a testament, proof that fragility and strength can share the same soul, and that when they do, admiration is not given. It is earned, one unglamorous step at a time. Beneath the applause that sealed her as America's sweetheart, Julia Roberts was quietly discovering how fragile the heart becomes when admiration drowns out intimacy. As Hollywood's lights began to lock onto her, her private world trembled. Before the title hardened into legend, she was drawn to Liam Neeson, a man older, steadier, already shaped by life. Beside him, the noise she had carried since childhood softened. His presence felt like still water after years of emotional turbulence. Their connection burned briefly, intensely, and then was gone, leaving behind something sharper than nostalgia. Friends would later notice how Julia grew quieter around him, how her laughter gave way to a reflective gravity. Long after, she would look back on that chapter as formative. Love, she understood, could shelter and unsettle at the same time. That awareness bled into her performances. As Shelby in Steel Magnolias, as Vivian Ward in Pretty Woman, critics sensed a depth in her eyes that felt lived in, not learned. Liam Neeson was never meant to stay, but he awakened a lasting capacity, the ability to carry tenderness and loss together, without choosing between them. As her career tipped from promise into phenomenon, another love arrived under far harsher light. Dylan McDermott entered her life just as everything accelerated. Steel Magnolias had announced her. Pretty Woman was about to transform her forever. Their connection was immediate, unguarded, and within months, they were engaged. For Julia, the ring was not a symbol of spectacle. It was a quiet hope for normalcy, a belief that something could remain hers alone while the world claimed everything else. But Hollywood does not look away. Cameras followed relentlessly. Whispers hardened into headlines. Privacy thinned until it barely existed. The ring on her finger, once intimate, became a public object, examined and judged by strangers. What should have been evenings of whispered plans turned into a performance she never agreed to stage. Under that pressure, the dream fractured. Within a year, it was over. Later, she would describe the feeling with painful precision, being welcomed everywhere, yet never fully belonging anywhere. When the flashbulbs dimmed and the noise moved on, she returned to quiet rooms, makeup still on, the ring placed carefully aside. She sat with the unbearable realization that love can erode when the world insists on standing too close, when nothing sacred is allowed to remain unseen. That lesson did not fade, nor did it strike only once. It settled into her bones, shaping how she guarded herself and how she worked. Affection could no longer exist untouched. Even joy arrived carrying an audience. Still, she moved forward, not hardened, but altered. She carried those fractures into her craft, letting them deepen rather than diminish her. The woman adored by millions learned early that admiration can fill every space in a life without ever offering shelter. What remained was resolve. The quiet decision to keep believing in intimacy, even after it had been exposed, thinned, and reshaped by light. In those years, Julia Roberts was becoming more than a star. She was becoming someone who understood that the brightest attention reveals the most vulnerable places, and that endurance, sometimes, is choosing to keep loving honestly after love itself has learned how easily it can be undone. At the exact moment Hollywood seemed to bow at her feet, Julia Roberts was walking straight into a love story the world had already crowned as destiny. In the early 1990s, her rise burned blindingly bright. Pretty Woman had turned her into a global promise, her smile flooding billboards, magazine covers, and dreams far beyond the screen. To the public, she appeared to hold everything at once. Yet behind the velvet curtain, her heart was building something far quieter and infinitely more fragile. At its center stood Kiefer Sutherland, magnetic, restless, alive with the same volatility that fueled her own ascent. Together, they became Hollywood's golden image, laughter frozen in photographs, hands intertwined on red carpets, intimacy framed as fate. The plans for their union swelled into spectacle. The invitations embossed in gold traveled to an elite circle. Designers whispered over ivory gowns. Flowers were ordered in cascades. The date itself was christened the wedding that would stop Hollywood. Tabloids sketched her imagined walk down the aisle. Fans spoke of her as if she were already a bride. But beneath that choreography of public fantasy, Julia dreamed in private. During fittings, she let herself imagine forever, not as a star, but as a woman finally building a refuge of her own. Friends remembered how her voice softened when she spoke of vows she wanted to write by hand, words meant not for cameras, but for one man alone. For someone raised amid fracture and silence, this was never about a ceremony. It was the trembling hope of sanctuary, a place where trust could endure, is where the girl behind the dazzling smile might finally rest. As June 1991 approached, the dream began to crack under the sheer weight of being seen. Whispers crept in, glances held too long, rumors passed too easily, suggestions that youth and fame were pressing too hard on something meant to live in shadow. Neither Julia nor Kiefer confirmed the noise, but it grew until it followed them everywhere, louder than their own voices. Then, 3 days before the wedding, the world was counting down to, Julia made the choice that would define her. She walked away. The shock rippled like an earthquake. What had been staged as a coronation of love became its sudden funeral. The ivory gown hung untouched, sealed in silence. The flowers ordered in abundance wilted where they stood. The altar waited for vows that would never arrive. The chapel transformed into a ghost, dressed for joy, emptied of it. Cameras descended without mercy. Headlines screamed of betrayal and fear, and the world consumed her heartbreak as spectacle. When the noise finally receded, Julia withdrew into stillness. Alone in a quiet room, she was no longer the sweetheart, no longer the bride the public had rehearsed. She was simply a young woman with trembling hands, staring at a future that had collapsed before it could be built. The ring that once promised permanence lay cold on a table. Years later, she would describe that moment not with drama, but with clarity. Leaving felt like tearing myself in two, but staying would have meant disappearing. Even Kiefer would later call her decision courageous. There was no public feud, and no venom, only the devastating recognition of two people reaching a crossroads where love could not survive the weight placed upon it. For many, a canceled wedding under such lights would have meant ruin. For Julia, it became a silent forge. She carried that unspoken loss into her work, allowing it to deepen rather than harden her. On screen, the pain lived between gestures, in pauses, in the way her eyes held back words. As Laura in Sleeping with the Enemy, critics sensed a vulnerability that felt raw, unsettled, lived. In Dying Young, her tenderness carried an ache no script could teach. The unworn gown, the empty altar, the bells that never rang. These were no longer gossip. They became part of her inner landscape, shaping performances that felt uncomfortably real. She did not emerge untouched. She emerged altered. As beneath the brightest lights, She learned how easily devotion can be overwhelmed, how intimacy thins when too many eyes insist on witnessing it. And still, she chose grace over bitterness, movement over retreat. The vows were never spoken, the veil never lifted. But from that silence, Julia Roberts carried something rarer than any fairy tale ending. She carried strength shaped by loss, and the resolve to keep believing in love even after the world had shown her how fragile it becomes when nothing is allowed to remain unseen. By choosing silence where the world demanded vows, Julia Roberts stepped into a quiet that scorched far deeper than any camera flash could ever reach. Having stood beneath Hollywood's most blinding lights and turned away from an altar built for spectacle, she emerged carrying wounds too exposed to close within a single season. Fame followed relentlessly, clinging to her shadow, but beyond premieres and lenses, she remained what she had always been, a woman searching for steady ground, aching for a place where her heart might finally stop bracing for impact. In the fragile wake of heartbreak, she reached for something human, something warm, and for a brief moment it arrived in the form of actor Jason Patric. Their connection was never meant to be immortalized. It was small, quiet, and almost invisible, a hand held while the earth beneath her still trembled. Friends would later describe it not as destiny, but as shelter, a pause amid ruins. Looking back, Julia would come to see that chapter not as escape, but as evidence of something stubbornly alive within her. "I wasn't reaching for forever," she would later admit in her own words. "I was just trying not to shut the door on feeling." That willingness to risk tenderness so soon after such public fracture revealed a resilience born not of bravado, but of refusal to harden. Then, in 1993, she startled even those closest to her by stepping into a life no one had written for her. America's sweetheart slipped quietly into a small Indiana church and married country singer Lyle Lovett. The moment unfolded almost unreal in its simplicity. No rehearsed spectacle. It's no grand procession. She wore plain white. He wore cowboy boots. It felt less like a headline and more like instinct, a sudden turn toward something unobserved. To the outside world, the marriage seemed impulsive, baffling, even reckless. To Julia, it was something else entirely. An attempt to anchor herself to ground untouched by expectation. She entered that church not carrying triumph, but exhaustion. The quiet hope that stepping outside the role she had been assigned might finally bring relief. For a time, the marriage offered gentleness. But gentleness alone could not mend the deeper fractures both carried. Less than 2 years later, they parted without spectacle or blame. There were no accusations, no bitterness, only the mutual recognition that their paths were not meant to remain aligned. Someone close to Julia would later say, "No, it didn't last, but it mattered." And perhaps that truth was enough. Sometimes the value of love is not measured by how long it endures, but by how safely it allows the heart to breathe, even briefly. Each ending left Julia standing alone again, but never empty. She had no children to anchor her days, no permanent hearth to retreat into, only herself, carefully folding away yet another dream. Still, she refused to turn private disappointment into public theater. Each relationship that flickered and faded became another layer beneath the smile the world recognized. They were not failures so much as footsteps, proof that her heart remained open despite everything that had tried to seal it shut. By the mid-1990s, she'd lived through a wedding abandoned in silence, romances that shimmered and vanished, then a marriage that ended with grace rather than ruin. To the world, they were headlines. To Julia, they were chapters in a longer pilgrimage, a search not for ceremony or rings, but for sanctuary. What she longed for was never the spectacle of love, but its shelter, something that would remain when the noise receded and the lights dimmed. That search was not finished yet. But somewhere beyond Hollywood's glare, in the wide quiet of a New Mexico ranch, the ground was already waiting, steady at last for the love that would finally stay. When the applause began to drown out her own heartbeat, Julia Roberts discovered that admiration can exhaust faster than it fulfills. Years of love stories that opened with promise and closed without resolution had left her standing still while the world surged past, cheering. She was famous beyond measure, beloved across continents, her smile stitched into billboards from Los Angeles to Tokyo. Yet inwardly, she drifted, unmoored. Triumph no longer felt like a scent. It echoed like a room too large to rest in. What she wanted now was not more praise. It was quiet. It was steadiness. It was a place where her heart did not have to brace for impact. In 2000, while filming The Mexican, that longing encountered something unexpectedly grounding in cinematographer Daniel Motter. He was not framed by spotlights or headlines, and he stood behind the camera, attentive, steady, unassuming. At the time, he was still married, and the world responded on cue. Rumors ignited, suspicion hardened, lenses hunted for fracture. Julia did not answer. Neither did Daniel. They chose restraint over defense, stillness over explanation. What mattered unfolded away from noise, the way time slowed in his presence, the way she was seen without being consumed. He did not meet an icon. He met a woman who had carried too much visibility for too long. What began as friendship deepened without spectacle. Later, she would describe the difference in her own careful phrasing, how, while many admired her from a distance, he remained close, valuing the person beneath the image. It wasn't fireworks, she would reflect. It was breathing again. His devotion did not dazzle. It endured. Even as scrutiny pressed in, they waited. When his divorce was finalized, their bond stepped forward, not as scandal redeemed, but as a choice made deliberately, in daylight, anchored in clarity. On July 4th, 2002, Julia Roberts chose a chapter that refused consumption. She did not walk into a cathedral. She stood beneath open sky at a New Mexico ranch, wildflowers nodding in the summer air, land stretching wide and quiet around her. The ceremony was so private that even some close friends learned of it only afterward. No cameras, no spectacle, just two voices choosing one another. She did not arrive as a symbol or a crown. She arrived as a woman who had learned what noise could steal. The world waited for headlines. She answered with silence. And inside that silence lived something unmistakable. This moment was not meant to be watched. It was meant to be kept. What followed was not transformation announced, but healing lived. With Daniel, she welcomed twins Hazel and Phineas in 2004, then Henry in 2007. The woman once measured by premieres and box office records found her proudest title in a single word she spoke without performance: mother. She said it simply, firmly, that the life she had built with her husband and children was everything, that waking up beside them mattered more than anything that had ever glittered. "I don't need to be everywhere anymore," she would say in her own way. "I need to be here." There was no triumph in the admission, only relief. Life at the Taos Ranch rewrote the rhythm she lived by. Scripts and red carpets gave way to breakfasts. A laughter filling sunlit rooms, evenings settling without interruption. Fame did not disappear. She still chose work that stirred her, but its glare softened beside the calm of mornings at home, the steady presence of a man who had never needed to be seen to stay. Daniel Motter became her anchor, not through grand gesture, but through consistency, the kind that turns turbulence into ground. And in time, it became clear that Julia Roberts' most demanding role had never been written for her. It was lived. Not Vivian Ward, not Erin Brockovich. However indelible those performances remain. Her truest role unfolded without rehearsal. Partner, mother, guardian of a life once thought unreachable. The woman shaped under relentless attention did not find healing in applause. She found it in persistence, in chosen quiet, and in love that remained when no one was watching. The world had crowned her a star long ago. But in the stillness of Taos, Julia Roberts discovered something rarer and brighter, a life that finally belonged to her. Even inside the refuge she had built with such care, far from Hollywood's relentless glare, life reminded Julia Roberts that peace is never a door that fully closes. At her Taos ranch, mornings often began with children's laughter spilling across sunlit floors. Ordinary sounds that once would have felt unreachable to the girl raised amid fracture and absence. Yet beyond those walls, another presence remained, a silence that lingered. In 2014, when her half-sister passed away, the loss arrived without ceremony, without spectacle, without the language the world so often demands of grief. It did not announce itself. It settled. Julia did not speak of it publicly. Those closest to her sensed she held the sorrow inward, almost protectively, as though naming it aloud might disturb the fragile balance she had fought so long to create, for herself, and for her children. At night, when the ranch finally fell quiet and the day loosened its grip, the absence surfaced, not as drama, but as weight, a still, pressing reminder. In those hours, she understood something with painful clarity, that even the brightest smile can tremble, and even a life shaped by love is not spared from loss. The grief did not break her. It deepened her. It taught her again what she had learned many times before, that survival is not choosing joy over sorrow, but learning how to hold both, without letting either erase the other. There was another silence she carried, older and heavier, shaped not by sudden loss, but by years of distance. The bond between Julia and her brother Eric had thinned quietly through the 1990s. They stretched taut as her fame exploded and his life unraveled under struggles the public rarely forgives. Addiction, legal trouble, the cruel habit of comparison. What began as misunderstanding hardened into distance, then into years where words went unsaid. Pride stood where tenderness once lived. For a long time, it felt as though the bond forged in their Georgia childhood had slipped beyond reach. Buried beneath resentment and wounds neither knew how to touch. Fame did not mend it. If anything, it sharpened the divide. And yet life, in its quiet mercy, offered a narrow bridge back. When Julia became a mother in 2004, something shifted. The arrival of her twins softened what had once seemed immovable. Eric would later recall that holding those newborns, faces untouched by history, unscarred by old grievances, opened something in him he believed was gone. In that moment, years of silence loosened their hold. Nothing was erased. No grand apologies were staged, but walls lowered. Love found a way through. What had once felt like a permanent rupture became a scar, visible, tender, but no longer bleeding. Reconciliation arrived not as triumph, but as grace, fragile and real. And so, in the rhythm of these years, Julia came to understand that healing is not the absence of pain. It is the decision to live honestly beside it. She had walked through storms that might have undone others, yet what emerged was not a life purified of sorrow, but one balanced by it. If Hollywood once measured her in box office numbers and red carpets, these quieter moments, loss carried in silence, A family bonds repaired inch by inch revealed the deeper measure of her humanity. The star the world adored did not fade. Her light simply changed temperature. It became gentler, steadier, lit not by spectacle, but by forgiveness, endurance, and the courage to keep moving forward even when the heart bears permanent marks. In that fragile balance between joy and grief, connection and loss, Julia Roberts did not lose herself. She found a way of living that finally belonged to her, shaped not for admiration, but for truth. In 2026, at the age of 58, Julia Roberts stands as one of the rare figures in Hollywood whose success has not only endured, but ripened with dignity. Her estimated net worth, often cited around $250 million, is not merely the residue of blockbuster paychecks, though those were historic in their own right. It is the cumulative result of restraint, selective roles, long-term brand partnerships, and an instinctive refusal to live louder than her own values. Roberts never chased excess as proof of arrival. Her wealth functions instead as insulation, buying privacy, protecting time, preserving family. For her, money was never about display. It was about distance from noise. And that philosophy quietly governs every corner of her present life, from how she lives to how she works, to what she now defines as success. And that clarity is most visible in the spaces she inhabits. The emotional center of her life remains her expansive Taos, New Mexico ranch, spread across acres of high desert, wide sky, and deliberate quiet. The main residence blends southwestern earth tones with unforced elegance, thick adobe walls, exposed wooden beams, stone fireplaces, and broad windows designed not to impress, but to breathe. Morning light pours across the kitchen. Evenings dissolve into silence broken only by wind and distant wildlife. This is not a retreat built for escape. It is a place built for return. Beyond Taos, she maintains carefully chosen homes in Malibu and San Francisco, each valued in the tens of millions, yet strikingly restrained for someone of her stature. These are not trophy properties. They are warm, lived-in spaces, long dining tables, on generous kitchens, personal art rather than accolades. Even her vehicles echo this ethic of intention over indulgence. A Mercedes-Benz G-Class, around $150,000, a Tesla Model S for daily practicality, and classic SUVs selected for safety and reliability rather than flash. Nothing announces excess. Everything suggests choice. Her daily life now is shaped by rhythm, not spectacle. She rises early, moves often, long walks across her land, strength training, yoga, and occasional horseback riding. Fitness is functional, not performative, oriented toward longevity and clarity rather than punishment. Nutrition follows the same principle: organic, balanced, largely home-cooked, with pleasure allowed but never weaponized. Aging to her is no longer a battlefield. Fine lines remain. Hair shifts naturally. The face that once defined Hollywood fantasy now communicates something rarer: ease. She has spoken quietly about no longer chasing an image, choosing instead to protect energy and health. Yet peace has not erased pain. Loss still arrives without warning. Grief still settles in places words cannot reach. Healing, she has learned, is not forgetting. It is learning how to live with what stays. At the center of her life stands family. Her marriage to Daniel Mater has endured for more than 2 decades, an anomaly in an industry built on exposure. Their bond is protected by absence. No joint branding, no public theater, no monetized intimacy. Their children, Hazel and Phineas, now young adults, and Henry, nearing adulthood, were raised far from cameras, encouraged toward education, curiosity, and self-definition rather than inherited fame. Hazel explored acting briefly, without pressure. Phineas and Henry gravitate toward quieter paths. Julia has been unwavering on this boundary. Her children did not choose celebrity, so they will not be conscripted into it. Motherhood, she has said, recalibrated everything: ambition, ego, fear. It taught her that love is rarely loud, and that protection often looks like disappearance. Professionally, she continues to work, but only on her own terms. In recent years, Roberts has favored prestige streaming projects, limited series, and roles that prioritize depth over exposure. She declines far more scripts than she accepts. Alongside her craft, her influence extends into philanthropy. Over the years, she has donated tens of millions of dollars to children's hospitals, global education initiatives, disaster relief, and organizations supporting women and underserved communities. Her giving is consistent, understated, and notably unbranded. Impact matters more than visibility. That same principle defines her cultural legacy. She is admired not only for what she achieved, but for what she refused to become. And this is where her true influence crystallizes, not in awards, at wealth, or longevity, but in the choices she made when no one was applauding. In an industry addicted to constant reinvention, Julia Roberts chose integration. She did not erase who she was to survive who she became. In a culture that equates excess with worth, she learned to stop at enough. Enough work, enough visibility, enough noise. Her life offers a lesson audiences feel rather than simply understand. Success does not require the erosion of character. You can rise without becoming rigid. You can endure without turning cynical. You can age without scrambling to stay relevant. What she models is not perfection, but alignment. The discipline of shaping a life where values, time, family, and work are not in constant war, where money protects peace instead of replacing it, but where ambition evolves instead of consuming the person who once needed it to survive. If this portrait of Julia Roberts resonates with you, if her restraint, emotional honesty, and refusal to live loudly for validation reflect something you aspire to, share your perspective in the comments. And if you're drawn to stories that look beyond headlines and examine what it really takes to live well after the applause fades, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we don't just follow fame. We explore what remains when the spotlight dims, and what kind of life is still standing after success has had its say.